You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. When it comes to infrastructure, smoke and mirrors or Twitter BS won't get the job done. It's going to take real money to rebuild real concrete and steel roads, bridges, airports, and water systems. The AFL-CIO says it's still waiting to see if Congress does anything on infrastructure investments. The Labor Federation says at least $1 trillion is needed to get started. If Congress makes that investment, it will create jobs, revitalize communities, and renew infrastructure, which in turn will pay ongoing economic benefits down the road in return for the investment. But the AFL-CIO says the investments must be done right, primarily through increased federal spending and credit support. And every dollar spent must be tied to creating good jobs with high road standards for workers. The AFL-CIO also wants to see Buy American provisions included. Labor has no objections to a private role if it includes strong safeguards for workers and the public interest. When neo-Nazis and fascists held their free speech rally in Portland, Oregon just days after 2 people were brutally murdered trying to defend Muslim women from a neo-Nazi, the Regional Carpenters Union knew which side it was on. Ben Basom is Director of Organizing and Communications with the Pacific Northwest Regional Council of Carpenters.
These types of groups, these right-wing extremists, have a long history of opposing organized labor. So it's very important that we, as organized labor, do what we can to oppose them. And we feel that opposing these types of fascist and racist activities in our city is very important as organized labor because it's us standing up for our members and for all marginalized carpenters, for one, but marginalized communities as a whole.
China Labor Watch says in 17 years of conducting investigations into working conditions at Chinese factories, none of its investigators were detained or arrested until they investigated the factory that makes Ivanka Trump products. Of 3 China Trade Watch investigators probing conditions at the plant supplying Ivanka Trump's company, 1 has been arrested and 2 are missing. China Trade Watch says, quote, "Our activists discovered evidence that a supplier factory for Ivanka Trump's brand company and many other brands had violated worker rights in ways that included forced overtime, wages lower than China's legal minimum wage, managers' verbal abuse of workers, and violations of women's rights." China Trade Watch says, quote, "We appeal to President Trump, Ivanka Trump herself, and to related brand companies to advocate and press for the release of our activists." The U.S. State Department has called on China to release the activists, saying that the U.S. is concerned by reports that these labor rights activists were detained by Chinese authorities.
Brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield National Labor Office, empowering working Americans with stable health coverage for over 50 years. The National Labor Office is committed to remaining the top choice for the 17 million union workers, retirees, and families they serve. Online at bcbs.com/NLO.
You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit laborradio.org.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show.
I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
You bet I cut the taxes at the top.
How dare you? How dare you? Go ahead, make my day.
The Rick Smith Show starts now.
Welcome, brothers, sisters, working class heroes. This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks for being here today on the big program. Lots of things to get to, lots to talk about. Tomorrow, the big day. Get the popcorn. Take the day off from work, whatever you got to do. It's countdown to Commie-thon. Major popcorn day. And, look, in truly Trumponian fashion, the Donald has attempted to steal this news cycle with the announcement of his replacement for James Comey by tweeting out this morning, "I will be nominating Christopher A. Rye, a man of impeccable credentials, to be the new director of the FBI. Details to follow." Just couldn't help himself, I guess. Woke up this morning feeling a little wry himself, and, well, couldn't help it. Had to let it out. Had to blurt it out. Like any state secret that you would share with a Russian spy, he just had to let it out. And you go, geez, oh, man. Not going to work, though. Hey, nice try. Nice try on trying to steal the news day. Got to give him credit. Got to give him credit for trying. Today is all about Comey. Today is all about the meeting. It's all about that. And look, it's being billed as the Super Bowl of political gamesmanship. It is. And, we heard yesterday the news of Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III offering his resignation in what I can only think was one of those, to make a very obscure Star Trek reference, of which I am not a Trekkie, but I think everyone gets the bones Captain Kirk kind of, "Damn it, Donald, I'm only a good old boy." Kind of a, just nonsense. He's not resigning. He's not going anywhere. This was an attempt to make him look somewhat independent. So lots of questions tomorrow. Lots of questions tomorrow for Comey. Going to be very interesting. But, to me, the fact that James Comey now knows what every 15-year-old beauty contestant has ever felt being left alone with Donald Trump should give us all pause. Here is a guy 6'8", powerful guy, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, head of J. Edgar Hoover and Mitchell Palmer's brainchild. Here is this guy who, virtually no one should intimidate this guy. Being intimidated, being left alone with Donald Trump. You kind of got to wonder. You gotta know that this guy knew where this was going, the kind of trouble he could get into, the kind of chaos that this would cause, and he didn't want to be left alone. I do find it interesting that he reached out to Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III as his savior, but it is what it is. Now, all of this stuff, everything that we see, all of the stories that are coming out, the Centipede basically is walking around barefoot right now. All kinds of shoes have dropped. And the polling on this is kind of, you got to wonder, if you're Donald, how much more you can take. The polling just out, Washington Post ABC poll points out that 56% of U.S. adults say that Donald Trump was trying to interfere in the investigation as opposed to cooperating. Now, most of us go, if you have got nothing to hide. And look, there are some who believe, Donald did nothing. And I got to be honest, I don't know that Donald did anything either. I got to question all of the people he surrounded himself with, but I don't know that Donald was on the phone with Putin saying, "Hey, how do we rig this?" I really don't. I think he believes that he has surrounded himself with people that he can trust. Kind of a dumb move. And that they would never do any of this stuff. But you see all of these stories coming out because, understand, everybody, all of those people around him have their own agendas. Trump, I don't know that he really has a core ideology other than looking in the mirror and say, "I'm wonderful. I'm the best. I'm the greatest." I don't know that anything outside of that really is at his core. So everybody around him has their own agenda. Now, what were they doing? That's a whole nother question. But you got to know that in the world that Trump comes from, he values loyalty, which is why you keep hearing these stories of people coming out going, he wanted me to pledge loyalty, wanted me to kiss the ring, wanted me to take the blood oath, put the brand on my behind, if you will. So people are waking up to this. I mean, 56% of the people saying, he fired Comey to interfere with the election. Had nothing to do with the good of the country. It had everything to do with what I think we all are coming to the conclusion of there's a lot going on here. Which again is why we need to have this open, transparent, and I'm good on Comey for wanting this to be on television, for wanting this to be out in public. Now, what will he say tomorrow? I don't know. There's a lot of speculation. He's not going to assess any idea of crimes committed, which is probably the smartest thing he could have done. Just the facts, ma'am. Just Joe Friday. This is what happened. And we, the American people, can take a look at it and go, who do we believe? Do we believe a guy who's got a lifelong career of being in the Justice Department, of being the head of the FBI, or do we believe the guy who, can't figure out, what reality is when he's tweeting one day to the next? He's taking credit for stuff that's destructive to our national security. And the big news yesterday is Qatar. When I first heard Trump, say, look what we've done, basically the Middle East is cutting them off. I said, did I not remember the so-called war on terror and all of the troops that are deployed there and all of the places that we launch out of there? Do I seem to forget that? And look, these are not great places. They're not, but strategically, he just burned somewhat of an ally in public. And now we find out that, maybe it's not even true what he burned them over. And again, nothing about this administration is accurate. Everything is a big, giant pile of steaming BS. And that really, every one of us should be stopping and going, the March for Truth the last weekend, we should have that every day. Because nothing coming out of this administration is true. We also are finding out now that the big arms deal, which I got to be honest, was not in favor of the arms deal. Evidently, the arms deal wasn't actually a deal. Didn't actually, there are no contracts. Even though, the Donald got the photo op, we just sold $110 billion worth of arms to the Saudis. And my first reaction was, is that a good thing? We're 11 of the 19 hijackers were basically, grown. Where you have extremists there who are just destroying human rights. Is that a good thing? Well, it turns out they're not actual contracts. They're more of, letters of intent. Yeah, we intend to maybe possibly consider. Because understand, with the price of oil in the dumps, Saudi Arabia doesn't have that kind of money anymore. And the thing that's interesting is, and I was asking these questions, all along going, don't we have to get some congressional oversight? Isn't there not an agency that goes, the president just can't go handing out gun contracts? Turns out there is. And none of those agencies have approved any of this stuff. Now, you can go back to the Obama administration, and a bunch of people sent me emails saying, well, Hillary was going to sell guns. And yes, that was the Obama administration. And they pulled back on it. It didn't happen. So most of these contracts, as I'm now finding out, were discussions that were had during the Obama years that they put the brakes on that they want to revive. And look, for everybody, and I know I'm going to get a bunch of stuff, people saying, what, but Hillary. Look, I wasn't a Hillary fan either. So save your but Hillarys. At the end of it, this guy is our president. He's the guy right now. This is the guy we hold accountable. And it seems right now nobody in that administration can be held accountable for anything yet, which is why I think, again, these hearings so very important, and why we have to have open, transparent government so that, look, I can't tell you how many people I talk to said, I don't believe anything anyone says anymore. That kind of massive disinformation campaign that I would argue that the Russians and the Republican Party have been doing for years, mostly the Republican Party, though. It's worked. Mission accomplished. Break out the Bush banner. Because they've now got us looking at each other sideways and now believing that nothing anyone says is true and that we just fall back on, well, I believe. Scary times. Going to take a quick break. Lots on the Russiagate. Lots on, Ohio. Some interesting information coming out of Ohio in light of the woman from Georgia being arrested for leaking out that, yes, indeed, the Russians were trying to hack our voting machines. Quick break, right back with Greg Palast. Stick around. This is The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
All of my life I've searched for clarity. I have wrestled with two paths buried deep inside of me. I lost some rounds, been knocked around, felt my share of defeat. Yet somehow I've always managed to get back on my feet.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1929. That was the day that Police Chief Orville Ederholt was shot and killed at a camp of striking textile workers in Gastonia, North Carolina. The textile mills had fallen on hard times in the late 1920s. During World War I, demand for cloth for uniforms had sent the industry booming. But at the end of the war, orders dried up. Then, to make matters worse, new fashion trends had women wearing shorter skirts, further cutting demand. In response, the mill owners at the Lorry Mill began what was called the stretch out. They laid off numerous workers and demanded that those who remained worked faster without raising wages or, in many cases, cutting workers' pay. The National Textile Workers Union recognized that these conditions made it an ideal time to begin organizing in the South. The Lorry Mill was the largest in the state. On April 1st, 1,800 workers went out on strike. The company responded by evicting strikers from company housing and hiring deputies to harass picketers. As tensions escalated, Police Chief Ederholt, along with some of his officers and company-hired guns, went to a workers' camp. When Ederholt was shot and killed by an unknown person, the police arrested dozens of strikers. 16 eventually stood trial, but no one was convicted. Then, in September, Ella Mae Wiggins, a popular speaker who wrote songs for the strikers, was shot and killed at a workers' rally. The union lost its fight, and North Carolina remains one of the lowest unionized workforces in the nation.
They labored in the textile factories from early morn till close.
Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
The billionaires don't want you to vote this year. We'll send you a message that's loud and clear that the votes can't be counted in your community. Why even register? Don't waste your energy.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind, you can email me, Rick, at thericksmithshow.com. So all of this stuff's coming out of Georgia, coming out of Ohio, all of the Russia, all of this stuff. Lots to talk about, which is why we've asked our good friend Greg Palast, investigative reporter, author, filmmaker of the recently released movie, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, a tale of billionaires and ballot bandits. Greg, thanks for taking time for us.
Wow, I just love your show, Rick. And I like that little history of labor history. I want the whole series.
No, well, laborhistoryin2.com, we have a couple of years worth there. But here's the thing. I mean, we look at what happened. The big news yesterday, the woman in Georgia, leaked this thing that basically tell us what we already knew. There's just so much to this, and what's frustrating is there's still people who go, I don't care.
Well, here's the deal. I mean, we now know that the Russians were actually trying to hack the machines. Before, I didn't really take much notice of this Russia stuff because Donald Trump didn't win the election, and it wasn't Russia. It was the fact that they used massive new vote trickery in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, North Carolina, Arizona, to basically, they use a cute term, suppress the vote. Hey, Rick, if someone steals your car, do you say, someone suppressed my car? No, they stole your car. They stole votes by the hundreds of thousands. And if you know Greg Palast, you know my work. That's one of the things I investigate for BBC, and this investigation actually was for Rolling Stone magazine, and we found that the GOP was using these new computerized techniques to make sure that the voters of the wrong color, that is blue voters, which are also black, Latino, and Asian American voters, don't get to vote because their ballots come out blue Democratic. And I don't care about that. I'm not a front guy for the Democratic Party. My God, they have their sins, but people should be allowed to vote for whom they want, no matter their color. We're litigating the civil rights movement of a half century ago, and this is the problem here. And now, yesterday, you had the release of a document by a courageous whistleblower, and this whole thing of arresting whistleblowers from Chelsea Manning, WikiLeaks documents, et cetera. This is horrible. But we had a courageous whistleblower willing to go to jail to get out the information that the Russians were trying to actually hack the voting machines themselves, but they got a lot of help. And this is the sick thing. You ready for this, Rick?
Hit me.
I did a story from Columbus, Ohio, the big swing state, just before the November election, days before. I was in a judge's chambers. I was allowed to come in as a journalist, and where I heard Republican county and state officials say that, yes, they had turned off the software that detects attempts to hack the voting machine. Now, the new electronic voting machines I know are scary because it's like we call them push and pray machines. We push the button and pray that they actually record the vote.
Right.
But the newer machines can be very sophisticated, and the ones used in Ohio, for example, the new ones, have a mechanism that keeps an image, a photo image of each ballot in sequence, so that you know something's missing. It also has detection software that says if anyone tries to break in or change something outside those voting hours, it would signal it and record a computer logging system. It's not that sophisticated, but it tells you if someone made an attempt to hack or did hack the machine. And this stuff was turned off.
And what was the rationale? What was the rationale for turning it off, Greg? I mean, there had to be a reason.
It is my mouth dropped. I mean, because I'm not big on this stuff that there's a lot of electronic vote theft, but I have to say my jaw dropped. And their excuse was, if we turned it on, there would be chaos, and it would be expensive. And it's like, you have to understand, I looked at the program. It's like when you turn on the electronic voting machines in Ohio, and many other states have the same systems, you have to make choices. It's a menu, where you get to choose what you want. Do you want the anti-hacking software on or off? Yes, no. Do you want the security of a photo record of the ballots on or off? That's all. You push a button, on, off. And they said that they couldn't push that button. It would cause chaos.
That's chaos.
Well, it only cause chaos if there were hacks to the vote or messing around with the vote. Why would that cause any chaos, and why would it cost any money?
Yeah, that's crazy. But what do you say to the
person? Yeah, well, it's crazy unless they are basically inviting a hack. That's the problem. In other words, a lot of the vote theft that I've uncovered in my career in the past 17 years covering this story of vote manipulation often is what I call vulture opportunism. People don't actually overtly steal votes; they just let the votes get stolen. They let it happen. And this is another case. Well, okay, we'll leave these. Okay, we won't. We're not going to rob the bank, but we're just going to tape the combination to the safe to the door of the bank.
We'll leave the keys in the lock. We'll leave the keys in the box for you.
It's like, really?
So is this a case? Well, let me ask you this: is this a case of, in your opinion, is this a case of just people who don't know what they're doing? Because a lot of elections people, they want to do what's right, but they're not really the brightest bulbs in the box. Or is this a nefarious thing where people are going, yes, I want my team to win, so this is where we're going?
The guy who is Secretary of State in charge of the vote in Ohio, for example, is a guy named John Huston. He makes Katherine Harris look like Thomas Jefferson in high heels. This guy knows exactly what he's doing. They know exactly. They're not stupid at all. In fact, Donald Trump has just put in charge of investigating vote fraud a guy named Chris Kobach, which is, by the way, he made this guy Chris Kobach, who's the Secretary of State of Kansas. He's in charge of voting in Kansas. But it's like making Al Capone, putting him in charge of investigating the mafia. This guy is a master vote stealer. There's no question about it. And he went to Harvard and Yale and Oxford. These guys are not stupid. They know what they're doing. The little old lady who tells you your name is missing from the voter rolls behind the desk, she's not stupid, but she doesn't know what's going on. She doesn't know why your name's missing. The people in those offices, they don't know, or they do know and they're scared to say a damn thing. That's how I get a lot of my inside information. By the way, this is Greg Palast. I won't give away your name, but if you are inside a voting office and you're listening to this in the Secretary of State office and you've got some documents or some information I should have, please go to gregpalast.com. Contact Greg. We love whistleblowers. Please, especially with documents, we will do anything to keep your name concealed. This material will be, I'll then put it in Rolling Stone or on BBC television. So please give me, if you got something that really disturbs you, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, but there's, you see all these stories, there's a lot of disturbing stuff going on. And while the Russians may not have been hacking into, because look, I'm told that you can't hack these machines because they're not hooked up to the internet. So to say that we can hack into them, what do you mean by that?
Well, okay, so in Ohio, we found, I was with the great attorney, voting rights attorney, Robert Trake, professor at Columbus State. And as he noted, we had pictures of computers for some reason that were connected to the internet. They do that so the machines can be updated. And then so at some point they do get connected to the internet, which is dangerous stuff, or Bluetooth. The other is, but that's,
Whoa, hold on. They can be hooked up via Wi-Fi?
Yeah, they want to update the machines, they want to which makes complete sense. But again, if you have this problem where they've got someone's credentials, this is what the report in The Intercept yesterday, because I read the entire report, and it's all about what they call, the gimmick called phishing, where, there's a dancing girl, click on her, and you get and suddenly your computer is seized. So we do have those problems. But I have to tell you, the main way that they do steal elections, not even through the computers, it's through the voting machine. Most people that lose their vote didn't get to vote in the first place. They removed their names from the voter rolls. And that's the real way that you steal hundreds of thousands, even a billion votes. That's what I was finding in my investigations for the Guardian and BBC and now Rolling Stone, where I work.
Which is why Kobach is such an important figure in this. Him in this Crosscheck system that they're trying to implement across the country.
Yes, let me just fill people in who don't hear this term. What the heck is Crosscheck? Crosscheck. If you remember, we got this president, Agent Orange, Mr. Trump, who claimed that 3 million people were registered to vote twice in the same election, double registered to vote twice in the same election in 2 different states. So Rick Smith would be registered in Ohio, and they find a Rick Smith or Richard Smith in Georgia, and they say, aha, it's got to be the same voter voting twice. And so they cross-check the voter registration of different states. So cross-check Ohio against Georgia and against Virginia, et cetera. Now, 3 million people, Donald? Now, the New York Times and the other mainstream press have said this is nonsense, it's a lie, it's not true. But they're missing the story. It's not about lie or nonsense. It's not a joke. They actually created a list of what they call 3.6 million people who voted twice. They actually have a list. It's 7.2 million names, right? 7 million names, that is, which they claim are 3 million voters voting twice. Who's on this list? Well, guys like Jose Hernandez, James Brown, Maria Hernandez, David Kim, David Lee. In other words, what they did was they took common ethnic names and found out that people with common ethnic names, believe it or not, there's a James Brown who voted in Detroit and a James Brown who voted in Ohio and a James Brown that voted in Georgia. And they say it's all the same guy. I can't make this up. It's really... Now, how do I know this? Because, Rick, I'm the only reporter, believe it or not, in the United States who actually said, give me the list. They wouldn't give it to me at first, but I'm an investigative reporter. If you see my film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, I read my Rolling Stone article, I got the list. And that's all it is a first and last name match. That's it. And on that basis, they've been removing hundreds of thousands of voters from the voter rolls.
Let me ask you this, though, Greg, because since you brought up Ohio, I grew up in Ohio, and when I moved to Pennsylvania, I was actually registered in both states. Now, I only voted in Pennsylvania. So isn't this all kind of the fact that we got all these people who are registered all over the place? That doesn't mean just because they're registered in two places that they actually voted in both of those places, does it?
That's correct. In fact, a number of people have been arrested for voting twice in the past 10 years. That literally involves billions of votes. We've voted many times in the last decade. There have been no more than 9 people, not 3 million, 9 at most. And I've scoured the records to find them. Georgia's gone through this total purge, burning down their voter rolls before this special election in Georgia between John Ossoff and Karen Handel, this runoff race in Georgia. They've just completely drained the voter rolls of people with common names, and using this Crosscheck system. And yes, a lot of people are people who have simply moved, and you don't vote twice. How many people move from their state and send a note to their Secretary of State saying, by the way, I've moved to California. I just did that. And please take my registration off the rolls. But what they do is you're still liable to getting your registration X'd out, getting purged off the voter rolls, because what they'll do is, here's the gimmick. They send a postcard to you at both addresses, even if you are, in fact, the same voter, just voting in one place. And if you don't respond to that postcard, they can throw you off the voter rolls. But it's like a piece of junk mail.
Right.
And we know, they know very well. First of all, if you use common names, you're getting ethnic names. 85 out of 100 of the 100 most common names in America are minority names. And like Washington and Lee and Chung and Wong and Hernandez. But even the people like yourself and myself who move state to state, if I don't respond to this postcard, why should I lose my vote? I mean, I've legitimately moved. I've never voted twice. It's easy to figure out if someone's moved because you put in a change of address at the post office and you may change your driver's license. Why are they doing this? They know how to remove people safely, effectively, and accurately, but they don't want to do it safely, effectively, and accurately. They want to get those voters that they don't like, and especially sending out a postcard, just so you understand, it's a simple thing. Suburbanites who've lived in the same house, white, upper-middle-class suburbanites, will get their postcard and are likely to return it. Students, poor people, unemployed people, low-income people who are moving around apartment to apartment, moving states to look for a job. They don't get their cards, or they're unlikely to fill them out. So it's a gimmick. Why are we asking people like Jose Hernandez if they prove you're not Jose Hernandez of Florida if you're voting in Georgia? What is that about? But this is the type of trick that they're pulling, and the mainstream media is missing it. They're simply saying Trump is crazy by saying they're illegal voters. The problem is, Rick, they're using this as a cover to remove legal voters, and that's what I'm uncovering for Rolling Stone, and just they don't want to talk about this in the mainstream media because we have this wonderful myth, as Joe Biden said, the American electoral system is the envy of the world because Joe Biden's never been anywhere but Kazakhstan.
But here's the thing. I mean, you go back and look. We want the shiny stuff. So Russia, we're attracted to the idea that we could make the argument that Trump won because of Russia. You're saying basically it was just as I said, it was the voter fraud. It was all of the voter ID laws. It was all of the purging, the caging, you name it. It was all that really gave him the election. But the Russia stuff is there too.
Well, yeah, and look, most of the Russia stuff, it's ugly. It's nasty. But it's hard to really claim, if you're in Pennsylvania, that people in Pittsburgh voted for Donald Trump because the Russians revealed John Podesta's emails. Remember, that's the accusation, that they hacked the DNC emails. John Podesta and Claire Wasserman Schultz. Most people in Pittsburgh don't know who John Podesta is, and they shouldn't. They shouldn't bother learning. And that didn't really affect the vote very much. Let's be honest. But the main thing is this messing with the actual voter rolls. That's the serious stuff. In Wisconsin, Brennan Center estimated 300,000 people, most overwhelmingly students and non-drivers, who are low-income people without a car, couldn't vote. 300,000 people were blocked. Trump won that by 20,000.
Yep.
Michigan, I was in Michigan, and I was in Michigan right after the vote. Trump wins by 10,700. If you go to gregpalast.com, you can see my report there from Michigan. And Trump won by 10,700, but 75,000 ballots were never counted in Detroit and Flint, because they have paper ballots, but they're optical scan read ballots. The machine reads the ballots. Their machines, 87 machines broke down in Detroit, 87, and that led to 75,355, to be exact, ballots never counted. In Detroit, were those Trump ballots? That's 7 times Trump's plurality. Come on, guys. Who won Michigan? We know. Who won Wisconsin? It was not just the ID laws. In Michigan, they're also using the system Crosscheck. Come on. We know who won, and it wasn't Donald Trump. And I'm not talking about the popular vote. I'm talking about in these key states. But that's what we should be looking at. The Russian thing is, obviously we should be investigating mischief by a foreign power in our election. That's not small stuff, but that's not how they broke into the bank.
Right. So why aren't we hearing this from the Clinton camp? Why aren't there voices out there outside of you, me, handful of other folks who are saying, look, this is where the real theft was?
I can't account. Look, the Democratic Party, and I'm going to be blunt, has Jim Crow and genes. It's the Democratic Party, not the Republicans, who invented Jim Crow to keep black people from voting, all kinds of trickery. And it's very hard to get out of that mode. And I'm being blunt about it. I mean, one of the things, for example, in Michigan, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, paid what people called it a recount, but it's not really a recount. In Michigan, it was counting those 75,000 ballots that were never counted. And Jill Stein paid to have them counted, but Trump's lawyers came in and said, Jill Stein can't have these ballots counted because she can't, no matter how many times you count them, she can't win. Only Hillary Clinton can demand a counting of those uncounted ballots. And Hillary's lawyers were sitting there in the courtroom, and the judge asked them, so what say Secretary Clinton? And the lawyer said, well, we're just here to observe. Clinton allowed those votes, and those are votes of black voters out of Detroit and Flint. She just threw, she didn't care whether those votes got counted. The Democratic Party goes to the black community every 2 and 4 years and says, give us your vote, because otherwise you'll get this ugly guy with, you'll get this ugly guy with orange hair or some other scare tactic. And, but they don't care whether those votes, most of the time they will not stand up for those votes because they're afraid if they stand up for the black vote that they'll lose more white voters.
Yeah, good point.
That's really the key issue.
You're right.
They are afraid.
So last question I've got for you then. What do we do? What do people do? Because look, we've been talking about this for a while. What do we do now? I mean, there was a great march for truth this past weekend. Should there be a march for the true vote? What should be done?
How about a march to the polls? Look, they can't steal all the votes all the time, Rick.
Yeah.
And you just have to assume a 5% steal. You got to win by 56%, not 51%. So one, flood them out, overwhelm them. Don't get discouraged from voting. In fact, make sure that you bring 5 more people with you. They steal 6 million votes nationally in a presidential election. That was my count. Bobby Kennedy and I did a calculation for Rolling Stone, and it was about 6 million votes. And so bring 7 million of your best friends to vote. I mean, that's one. Number 2, get informed. Listen to Rick Smith and take notes. Go to gregpalast.com. Watch my movie. Unstupid yourself. Don't let them throw you the garbage. And get angry, get active. That's how, Martin Luther King got the Voting Rights Act, not because he had voting power, because he didn't. That was the whole point. Black folk did not have the vote. And they got it by, as you say, by marching, by intense pressure nationally on politicians where they had power, by screaming bloody murder, and by getting out the fact that people were not allowed to vote. And we've got to go back to basically a new voting rights movement. It will be marching. It will be writing letters. It will be voting and getting other people to vote. It will be getting angry and getting active. I don't know any other solution. That's how it's always been.
There you go. I like it. Get unstupid yourself. Good stuff, Greg. Always great talking with you. I look forward to having you back again real soon.
Thank you very much, Rick. You're the best. Bye.
Anytime. Good friend, Greg Palast. Again, gregpalast.com. The movie, a must-see. Great stuff. You can follow him at Greg Palast, at Greg_Palast. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1912. That was the day Boston Carmen of Local 589 voted to strike. Workers had been fighting to organize for years. They now demanded union recognition. In the months before the strike, union representatives had attempted to meet with management with no success. The president of the L, in the days before it was called the T, went so far as to summarily fire 282 employees, claiming the need to maintain discipline. Incensed at the union-busting maneuver, workers walked off the job in the early hours of the morning. They began cutting trolley ropes, smashing train windows, and removing handles on controller boxes. In an effort to bust the strike, management formed a company union. They also brought in over 700 professional strikebreakers and provided housing for the scabs. Over the course of several weeks, dozens of strikers were arrested on charges that ranged from calling strikebreakers scabs to trumped-up felony charges. AFL President Samuel Gompers visited the picket line in a show of solidarity. Area labor unions provided financial and legal support. The union filed charges with the State Board of Arbitration. They argued management had caused the strike by firing hundreds of workers for union activity and coercing workers against joining the union. Once the board confirmed the union's charges, the governor and mayor both pushed for resolution. As well, Boston's Central Labor Union threatened a general strike. Union recognition finally came on July 28th, and the first contract was signed a year later. Since that time, Local 589 has weathered more than a century of anti-union storms as it continues to fight for better wages, hours, and conditions. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
From United Nations headquarters in New York, this is your World in 2 Minutes. I'm your host, Luke Vargas, for Talk Media News. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley was in Geneva on Tuesday for a major announcement about whether the U.S. would remain in the UN Human Rights Council. Unlike the Paris Agreement on climate change, Haley said the U.S. wants to try and reform the council from the inside, and she highlighted 2 ways the council could regain its legitimacy and keep the U.S. as a member. The first was electoral reform.
Being a member of this council is a privilege, and no country who is a human rights violator should be allowed a seat at the table.
A second area of reform, she said, was toning down the council's focus on Israel, the only country with a permanent agenda item on its schedule.
It's hard to accept that this council has never considered a resolution on Venezuela, and yet it adopted 5 biased resolutions in March against a single country, Israel. It is essential that this council address its chronic anti-Israel bias if it is to have any credibility.
While Haley's speech to the council got a polite welcome, she faced a tougher crowd at a graduate school later in the day, where her praise of Israel was met with laughs.
This relentless, pathological campaign against a country that actually has a strong human rights record makes a mockery not of Israel, but of the council itself.
Later on, the crowd cheered when an audience member asked if the U.S. should be investigated for rights abuses at Guantanamo Bay, and she was heckled when she attempted to dodge the question. With the audience grumbling, Haley offered a surprisingly candid admission about how her role differs from the Trump administration as a whole.
While you may say the administration is not showing certain actions, I am. And I am part of that team.
For more global news headlines, visit talkmedianews.com.
The most important issues of the day. This is The Rick Smith Show.
The countdown to Comic-Con. Cannot wait. Get the bowl of popcorn. Take the day off. Go to the bars. Evidently, the reporting coming out of San Francisco, they're opening bars early so people can get their drink on. Whether you're in favor of the investigation, you want to see Trump go down, or whether you want to see him do well, it's all about the drink. Wow. Sad, scary. Oh, my goodness. And you know what? Thing is, we got so many other things to take care of. Just not getting done. Anyway, here to talk about and find out what's going on around the world. And there in New York City, we got Luke Vargas, Talk Media News. Luke, what's going on, man?
Hey, Rick. Kind of cool to hear my own voice before I come on. That's a trip.
There you go. We love that little segment that you do.
I'm
good
glad.
Stuff. Here's what's going on. I understand that the president tried to steal the news cycle today.
Yo, what's new about that? I mean, so we have a new FBI appointment, or someone that the president would like to see in there. And he's someone who, and we'll talk about this, we can zoom out a little bit, but he's very well known to Chris Christie, who was, big in the transition, but then seemed to have been sidelined. Christopher Wray is Christie's former attorney who defended the New Jersey governor during the Bridgegate scandal. My immediate read on this is that Jared Kushner should be very concerned about his future. I mean, Chris Christie getting a bigger role within the administration. You'd have to think that Christie was involved to some extent in lobbying Trump to pick this guy for this role. There were many other FBI names within the FBI and other attorneys and former folks who work in intelligence that he could have picked. And remember, Christie himself went after Jared Kushner's father, helped put him in jail. One wonders, as Kushner seems increasingly embroiled in this whole Russia scandal, if he isn't shivering in his boots, knowing that someone is about to come to the FBI who probably, knows a little bit about him already. So that's an interesting element to this. I will say about Wray in general that the consensus seems to be that he's a qualified outsider, given that he was a former Justice Department official. He ran the criminal division of the DOJ from 2003 to 2005, so he interfaced with the FBI quite a bit. So qualified outsider, but still an outsider. And that's important because we have seen time and time again with the FBI through history that when they feel like their independence as an agency is under threat by political appointees, they can lash out and they can make life really difficult for the administration, whether that means leaks, whether it means expanding investigations into those that the White House prefers not be under scrutiny. those are all things that could come of an FBI director who does not inspire confidence among the rank and file. So this is a very difficult job for Wray, even though, again, he seems like a qualified outsider. He is still an outsider nonetheless.
Yeah. Interesting on the Kushner angle, because yesterday everyone was saying, did Trump give him the kiss of death by saying that he's more popular than Donald? So it could be interesting days for him. Now I understand New Jersey, with Christie going out, there's going to be an election coming up. Goldman Sachs guy, another Democrat, really?
I know, sort of a mirror of John Corzine, who is the former Democratic governor and also a Goldman Sachs exec. He was the Democrat last in that office before Christie came in several years ago. This guy, Phil Murphy, spent 23 years at Goldman Sachs and has some sort of questionable things on his rap sheet, according to I believe it's the Asbury Park Press here in New Jersey, which reported that one of the big investment wings that he ran at Goldman Sachs was heavily involved in some companies that were responsible for horrible working conditions overseas. So he's not just very rich, but there are some allegations that his money really isn't terribly clean. I will say this, it's sort of disconcerting, I guess, if you're on the progressive half of the Democratic Party, that a candidate like this in a deep blue state is getting, basically rushed or fast-tracked toward the State House. I mean, the sort of postmortems of the 2016 campaign, the takeaway was probably best to focus on people who can really just gin up excitement based on their policy positions, not because, they spend $22 million on the race, don't have a day job, and are able to use all of these sort of establishment tactics to get on the ballot. And I will say there's a weird provision of the New Jersey Democratic primary process that if you get a certain number of local endorsements, you get to sort of skip the line in the order on the ballot and be listed first instead of alphabetically like everybody else. So this guy threw a whole ton of money at this race, made friends with all the sort of party bosses, if you will, in a state that has a very hierarchical Democratic Party. And thus, if you're just going to vote the ticket and vote for all of the local candidates, he's going to appear right next to them in that first slot. And there was a study that said that's responsible for hundreds of thousands of votes in the New Jersey electoral process, even if people don't even know who they're voting for. I mean, they'd vote for an orangutan if it was in the first spot on the ballot. So lots of institutional advantages there. And again, is that the right move in a deep blue state that probably could have helped propel a progressive candidate onto the general election ticket? The sort of party machinery keeps churning out folks who are not terribly inspiring, and it didn't in this case even seem like he really wanted the job. That said, he's probably going to win. It's not like the Democrats are fielding a candidate in a very tight race. It looks like he will probably be the governor. The Republican candidate's even less popular. But again, if we are going to take lessons away from 2016 and try to implement them, it looks like, at least in this case, New Jersey is not going to be the one to do that.
And by make friends, you mean bought, right?
I won't say that directly, but it certainly helps when you don't have anything else to do with your time. And I'll say, here's a guy who gave tens of millions of dollars to the Democratic Party and then was appointed through, the sort of patronage lane for the ambassadorship to be the ambassador to Germany by Barack Obama. So, and Angela Merkel herself said she didn't like the guy and that, she wished President Obama had put a career foreign service agent into that job instead of a political appointee. So, anyways, there you go.
Again, another one of those moments where you go, we got to get the money out of politics. You've got to get these billionaires who have turned politics into their new polo. We've got to figure out how to get this out of there.
Yeah, I will say there was an interesting. I don't know all that much about this. Maybe it's something worth looking into. But the one policy idea he had was some sort of idea for like a Bank of New Jersey. I guess it's been decades and decades since the state had one of these sort of infrastructure
like North Dakota does.
Okay. I don't know all that much about it, but that was the one. I live in New Jersey, so I was getting the flyers, and there was sort of a half-hearted attempt to say, oh, this guy's like, yeah, he's a banker, yeah, he's a Wall Street guy, but he's got this idea about how to, instead of just, having Citibank or something run all of the investments for the state, let's make it a state bank, and they can plow a higher percentage of the earnings back into, I think it was like writing down tuition debt and funding infrastructure. So maybe he's not just, sort of cut from the same cloth as the establishment candidates before him. But I think that remains to be seen.
No, because I keep meaning to delve into the state banking ideas because during the collapse of 2008, 2009, North Dakota didn't have as big a hit as everybody else did because they didn't do what the other banks had done. They adhered to the old style mentality that we keep the gambling and the boring banking separate, and that you make your home loans and you make your car loans and that safe stuff over here, and you do your gambling somewhere else. Seems sane and rational to me.
Yeah. Hey, I'm not the one to answer many questions about that, but maybe something to look into, especially if a future governor is going to have that as a policy idea.
And finally, the Donald yesterday took credit for, I guess, most of the Middle East dumping Qatar. What's going on there?
Well, it's a weird story, and I think it surprised a lot of folks, not least at the State Department and the Pentagon, when President Trump tweeted out yesterday that the reason that the Saudis and all these other countries in the Gulf had cut all their diplomatic ties with Qatar was because Qatar was funding terrorism. That's a very odd statement to make about the country that hosts the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East, which is currently being used to run the campaign against the Islamic State. So, and probably suffice it to say, Trump was unaware of the fact that we had those diplomatic ties with them. He seems very inclined to believe the Saudi line, no matter what it is. And the reasons for Saudi Arabia and all these countries ganging up on Qatar are quite clear. These are monarchies. They don't like the fact that Qatar has for decades had an independent foreign policy, and they have backed groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which to some is a terrorist group, to others was a democratically elected party in Egypt that was destabilizing to the military and to other kingdoms around the Middle East. And, they have been getting backing from Qatar. So places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, all these other kingdoms, which are quite repressive and do not like sort of populist movements, had tried to look for reasons to isolate Qatar and punish them for having those viewpoints. So Trump seems to have just towed the party line there. We'll see how this shaped up. We are facing sort of a socioeconomic death spiral in Qatar. It's a very, very wealthy country, but they are almost entirely reliant on imports from their land and sea borders and their air links to be able to, keep the population, alive, basically. And now all those sort of food imports are cut. We've heard about, runs at the grocery store. It's a dangerous situation in the Middle East. And again, it really sort of calls into question this unity that Trump said he was able to achieve in the Middle East in the fight against terrorism. In fact, the members of the GCC, the big Gulf Council, appear as divided as they've ever been. And this is a pretty severe diplomatic spat here, the likes of which we haven't seen in many years. So again, I think the oddest part here was that you had a U.S. president really accusing a crucial ally to our own military of supporting terrorism. That, to me, seems like it has a lot of downside risks that Trump was just completely blind to.
Well, I mean, really? Are we? Should we be surprised by any of this at this point? I mean, come on. When you said, I don't think he really knew that, no, I guarantee he had no idea that we had anything to do with that country, and it just sounded like a good tweet at the moment. And here's the other part of this, and maybe you're getting some of this. There's reports that what caused this was a whole bunch of fake stories by the Russians. Anything there?
Yeah, probably. In fact, what basically happened was last month you had the lead Qatari state news agency website was hacked, and hackers went into different articles, a pretty malicious kind of attack here, and one that you start to think, oh man, it's not just governments and things like that are vulnerable to this hacking, campaign servers and things like that, but news websites. And they went in there and falsely attributed all these critical quotes to the Qatari foreign minister, in which he was critiquing the United States, critiquing the Saudis, all these sorts of things. And then it caused all these countries to pile on and say, how dare you guys be so insulting to all these countries that are helping you out in the fight on terrorism. And yes, as of a few days ago, it appears it may have been Russian hackers behind that. So for then the U.S. to pile on and sort of feed into that, suggestion that Qatar is dragging its feet and saying all these horrible things is sort of towing more of the Russian and Saudi line than it is what our own intelligence community is saying, but that's a trend we've certainly seen no shortage of in the past few months.
Scary stuff. Luke, I appreciate the time. Great talking with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Luke Vargas, Talk Media News Service. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. This is The Rick Smith Show for working people on the phone.
Radio of, for, and by we the working people. The Rick Smith Show.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. When it comes to infrastructure, smoke and mirrors or Twitter BS won't get the job done. It's going to take real money to rebuild real concrete and steel roads, bridges, airports, and water systems. The AFL-CIO says it's still waiting to see if Congress does anything on infrastructure investments. The Labor Federation says at least $1 trillion is needed to get started. If Congress makes that investment, it will create jobs, revitalize communities, and renew infrastructure, which in turn will pay ongoing economic benefits down the road in return for the investment. But the AFL-CIO says the investments must be done right, primarily through increased federal spending and credit support. And every dollar spent must be tied to creating good jobs with high road standards for workers. The AFL-CIO also wants to see Buy American provisions included. Labor has no objections to a private role if it includes strong safeguards for workers and the public interest. When neo-Nazis and fascists held their free speech rally in Portland, Oregon just days after 2 people were brutally murdered trying to defend Muslim women from a neo-Nazi, the Regional Carpenters Union knew which side it was on. Ben Basom is Director of Organizing and Communications with the Pacific Northwest Regional Council of Carpenters.
These types of groups, these right-wing extremists, have a long history of opposing organized labor. So it's very important that we, as organized labor, do what we can to oppose them. And we feel that opposing these types of fascist and racist activities in our city is very important as organized labor because it's us standing up for our members and for all marginalized carpenters, for one, but marginalized communities as a whole.
China Labor Watch says in 17 years of conducting investigations into working conditions at Chinese factories, none of its investigators were detained or arrested until they investigated the factory that makes Ivanka Trump products. Of 3 China Trade Watch investigators probing conditions at the plant supplying Ivanka Trump's company, 1 has been arrested and 2 are missing. China Trade Watch says, quote, our activists discovered evidence that a supplier factory for Ivanka Trump's brand company and many other brands had violated worker rights in ways that included forced overtime, wages lower than China's legal minimum wage, managers' verbal abuse of workers, and violations of women's rights. China Trade Watch says, quote, we appeal to President Trump, Ivanka Trump herself, and to related brand companies to advocate and press for the release of our activists. The U.S. State Department has called on China to release the activists, saying that the U.S. is concerned by reports that these labor rights activists were detained by Chinese authorities.
Brought to you by Blue Cross Blue Shield National Labor Office, empowering working Americans with stable health coverage for over 50 years. The National Labor Office is committed to remaining the top choice for the 17 million union workers, retirees, and families they serve. Online at bcbs.com/NLO.
You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit laborradio.org.
NAFTA, tell me how you came about the decision.
Well, I was going to terminate NAFTA as of 2 or 3 days from now. The president of Mexico, who I have a very, very good relationship, called me. And also the Prime Minister of Canada, who I have a very good relationship, and I like both of these gentlemen very much, they called me. And they said, rather than terminating NAFTA, could you please renegotiate? I like them very much. I respect their countries very much. The relationship is very special. And I said, I will hold on the termination. Let's see if we can make it a fair deal, because NAFTA has been a horrible deal for the United States. It's been very good for Canada. It's been very good for Mexico, but it's been horrible for the United States. And if you check my campaign, any of my speeches, I said I'll either renegotiate or I'll terminate. So they asked me to renegotiate. I will, and I think we'll be successful in the renegotiation, which frankly would be good because it would be simpler. But we have to make a deal that's fair for the United States. They understand that. And so I decided, rather than terminating NAFTA, which would be a pretty big, shock to the system, we will renegotiate. Now, if I'm unable to make a fair deal, if I'm unable to make a fair deal for the United States, meaning a fair deal for our workers and our companies, I will terminate NAFTA. But we're going to give renegotiation a good, strong shot. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. So the renegotiation's evidently going to happen, and right now there's an open comment period where folks can go and share their thoughts. What should we be renegotiating for? Lots of things on my mind, and here to help us go through some of that, I've asked Celeste Drake. She's the AFL-CIO's Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist. Celeste, thanks for taking time for us.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rick.
So you've got that really long, drawn-out clip there of President Trump going, you know what? They like me a lot. I like them. We're going to have this kumbaya moment. We're going to renegotiate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's not our view that good trade deals are created just because folks like each other. It's actually really about what are the rules and who benefits and who is hurt by those rules. Those are the key questions.
Yep. And for me, this concept, and maybe you'll agree with me, maybe you won't, because I've argued this 1,000 times. Just the mindset of the least restrictive trade barrier seems to me to be the wrong path. Because it then goes with gutting environmental regulations, gutting labor laws, just a race to the bottom kind of mentality.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's not often talked about enough is that how restrictive that standard is in terms of folks that are sort of pro free trade at any cost are always say the freedom to import goods from wherever and the freedom. But how much freedom have we lost when we have agreed to a trade rule that says you can't make a regulation based on what's most protective of human life? You can't make a regulation based on what's most protective of precious and rare valuable resources. You can't make a protection based on what's going to best and most efficiently address climate change. You only have the choice to choose the least trade restrictive possible. And that's just not good decision making, nor is it good for our democracy because we've lost a whole bunch of choices.
And for me, the other big one is you can't then say we want to make sure that if we're going to build a bridge, we can use American-made steel or cement or whatever. You now take that ability because that's a trade restriction, right?
Absolutely, and then that is a choice that is taken away. And for us, of course, the labor movement, we support buy domestic policies. Whether it's buy local, buy state, buy national, and support the ability of other countries to make those same choices. And then you can sort of duke it out with the various interests domestically through your democratic process. And for, Project X, the policy might be we're going to buy the cheapest no matter what. And then for Project Y, you can win and say we've got to source from American-made products. But you no longer even have the ability to fight that out domestically when you give away your rules to basically benefit global corporations under the guise of international cooperation.
Now, I got to tell you, though, I don't want to, I drove over the Tappan Zee recently, the bridge going into New York, and the idea of the lowest bid winning that contract kind of scares me. Because I'm not a really great swimmer. I can swim enough to save my life, but I don't know I can swim a couple of miles across the Hudson to get to the other side. So the idea of the cheapest guy who's going to use the cheapest products and water down the cement, that doesn't appeal to me as not a really great swimmer.
Absolutely. And so there's a lot of other questions about where are we creating the jobs? What's the quality of the product? And even questions about, how are the workers on the project being treated? Like, can we as a society say, if you provide benefits for spouses of your employees, you've got to also provide benefits to same-sex spouses. If you use a highly polluting component, you have to choose sort of the greenest, or you have to choose, what's recycled versus, brand new. There's a whole host of choices that can be limited by putting in trade rules that essentially point all governments to always buying the cheapest, no matter, whether it was made with slave labor, no matter what.
Yeah. Or, we're going to get the drywall from China that's made with asbestos that was making people sick. If you remember, after the Hurricane Katrina, all the FEMA trailers were making people violently ill because basically the drywall was poisoning them. But hey, it was a lot cheaper.
Absolutely. And those standards preventing lead from being included in children's toys, that's another waste of regulatory red tape, right? Unless you're the parent who's got the toy with the lead in it.
Yeah, but
so
the lead tastes so good, though.
Well, it's easy for I think the business community that's always looking for more ways to free itself from regulations to make these arguments that mock very important protections that working families built and created over decades to work hard to live in a safe community and a safe environment. And just write those off as sort of trade barriers or wasteful red tape. But when you get right down to it, it's actually very important that we have rules against forced labor, against poisonous ingredients in our products, against all of these things. And these are the kinds of things that can go away and be challenged by trade rules. For instance, the cool labeling, country of origin labels for beef and for pork were recently repealed in the United States. Congress voted on it, and President Obama signed it because of a trade challenge, because labels that inform consumers where their meat comes from were determined by the World Trade Organization to be barriers to trade. And that's just silly. That's informing folks of what they're purchasing. That's something that consumers in the U.S. wanted. Congress voted for it, and then all of a sudden it became a trade barrier. So these are not just theoretical problems with trade. These are real problems, and the U.S. has lost on country of origin labeling. The U.S. has lost on dolphin-safe tuna labeling. The U.S. has lost a number of times at the WTO, and in the end, the corporations still make their profits, but the rest of us are a little worse off every time we lose one of these cases.
Yeah, and when you brought this up, I mean, we have these secret tribunals that we can't just go watch these cases, can we?
Well, I guess if you could get to Geneva, you might have some potential to access what's going on. But, speaking as a lawyer, even if your only access is to be able to read the outcome, the problem is these decisions are, 300, 400, 500 pages long, and that's not good legal writing. In good legal writing, you narrow down to only the issue you need to decide. You ignore all the extraneous stuff, and you say, this is the crux of the case. This is why I, as a judge, am deciding what I'm deciding, and a good legal decision should be more like 7, 10, 12 pages long, not 500. So it's really designed to be inaccessible so that the economic elites that have this corporate bent and they have this case to make can say, well, you should leave it to us technocrats because you're not capable of understanding it. When the truth is, we can all understand what's going on here. It's just being hidden and obfuscated by all this technobabble.
What do you say? I just had this argument over the weekend, and leave it to me to get into these really in-depth argument with liberal elitists who I just despise at this point, who now say that you got to get over this trade issue, Celeste. This is the new world. There's no more that labor stuff, all of that uneducated labor. It's going to be done somewhere. Get over it. What the answer here is, you just need to educate yourself and let other countries with cheaper labor do this stuff. How do you respond to that, other than just wanting to reach across and strangle somebody?
I definitely understand that impulse, and essentially what those folks are doing. Again, I mean, it's lying. Just to be clear, they're obfuscating the truth. The only choices are not. We don't have the choice of the current model of globalization in which corporations win and pretty much everybody else loses, or some sort of isolationism and xenophobia. That's a straw man argument. That's a false choice. Globalization, in terms of trade between all of the 200 countries in the world, that's real and that's happening. And nobody's saying, let's go backwards. The question is, does globalization have to occur in the way that it's occurring? Does it have to always benefit corporations, drive down wages, degrade the environment, be highly polluting, get rid of our protective standards? And the answer is no. It's that way because the rules of trade deals, the rules of trade policy have set it up that way. And our argument, this whole trying to demean us, those manufacturing jobs are gone, that's just silly. There's, of course, a wide variety of manufacturing jobs from lower end, lower skilled to higher end, very highly skilled. The whole point is, no matter what kind of job at what skill level, how do we set up global economic rules so that workers, whether they're in service industries, manufacturing industries, whatever, blue collar, pink collar, white collar, no collar, can have decent work at decent pay, provide for their families, save for retirement, do all of these things, and we can. It's just not going to happen with this set of rules that says get rid of regulations, empower corporations. It requires a new set of rules that say protect labor rights, take some of that excessive power that's been given to corporations, take it back, work together to make sure that those corporations that are profiting are paying their fair and share in taxes and taking that money and investing it back in people, investing it back in infrastructure, creating those pathways for shared prosperity. And so when those folks say get over it, what they're really saying is I'm not interested in talking to you about a progressive, fair economy where we all benefit. And so we need to call them on that, lie that they're selling.
Yeah. So now there's a chance that maybe, possibly the Trump administration renegotiating this. I got to be honest, I have no hopes of anything positive. But there's a period now where people can comment. What should we be telling them to do?
People can and should comment, regardless of whether you trust the administration. This is always an opportunity that we have. That we had the same opportunity at the outset of the TPP negotiations under Obama. And folks should be saying, number one, first and foremost, the negotiations for the new NAFTA must be open and transparent and democratic. Folks need to be able to know what's being put on the table in their name. And they need to be able to sort of view the progress as it goes along. Trade negotiations should be as open as pushing a bill through Congress. So sure, there are conversations that happen behind closed doors, but you get to see the bill when it's introduced. You get to watch the markup in public. You get to advocate for this amendment and not that amendment. And we need to open it up that way. And that's really by including working people, communities of faith, small farmer organizations, environmental advocates at the table is the only way we're going to get our interests included in the deal. If it's as closed as it has been, NAFTA will end up worse than it is now, if that's conceivable. And then we need to start talking about no investor-to-state dispute settlement. That's these private special courts for foreign corporations only. That has to be out. We do have to protect labor and the environment. And we do need to do some of these other things to prevent global corporations from cheating us on taxes, from destabilizing the financial system, from using trade rules to say, that important regulation that keeps your child safe is, quote unquote, a barrier to trade. So there's a lot of things, but folks need to talk about the openness of the process first, and then talk about what's important to them and to say that we're going to be here. We're going to continue speaking up. It doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter who's the USTR. The rules that would make a fair economy are the same, and we're going to keep advocating for them.
Yeah, and keep fighting for it, even with Trump in there. Because, look, I've been saying for a while, Trump won on with a lot of union votes because he was out there talking the union message, which is saying trade, good jobs. Even though I don't think anything he's going to do is going to bring that, he had the rhetoric. Now it's us that need to hold him accountable and push them in that direction, right?
That's absolutely right. And just because Trump actually took some of our rhetoric on trade and used it doesn't make that rhetoric wrong. We still want fair trade that works for working people. We want trade that raises wages and creates jobs. What we don't want is all the other things that he campaigned on, xenophobia and immigrant bashing and all of that. And the labor movement is not associated with, that at all. And you just had a great clip on before I came on about the carpenters in Oregon, and that's fantastic. That's where the labor movement stands against fascism. But certainly just because somebody has decided we have some good talking points on trade doesn't mean those talking points are bad. We need to keep pushing them and holding all elected people accountable.
There you go. Celeste, I appreciate you taking time. If folks want to chime in on this, where's the best place to go?
They should go to aflcio.org, and there's a lot of resources there on trade. And just to give you a preview, on Monday, we will be releasing a comprehensive, long document of all kinds of things that can be done to improve NAFTA. So look on our web space and in the press that day for our release, and I'd be happy to come back and share that with you after we release it.
Good stuff. Looking forward to it, Celeste. Always great having you on. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Take care.
Alrighty, our good friend Celeste Drake. Again, aflcio.org. The website, we'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com of how you can chime in, be heard, and maybe push in the right direction. Quick break. Right back. Stick around to listen to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Exposing that free trade is never free. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1929. That was the day that Police Chief Orville Ederholt was shot and killed at a camp of striking textile workers in Gastonia, North Carolina. The textile mills had fallen on hard times in the late 1920s. During World War I, demand for cloth for uniforms had sent the industry booming. But at the end of the war, orders dried up. Then, to make matters worse, new fashion trends had women wearing shorter skirts, further cutting demand. In response, the mill owners at the Lorry Mill began what was called the stretch out. They laid off numerous workers and demanded that those who remained worked faster without raising wages or, in many cases, cutting workers' pay. The National Textile Workers Union recognized that these conditions made it an ideal time to begin organizing in the South. The Lorry Mill was the largest in the state. On April 1st, 1,800 workers went out on strike. The company responded by evicting strikers from company housing and hiring deputies to harass picketers. As tensions escalated, Police Chief Ederholt, along with some of his officers and company-hired guns, went to a workers' camp. When Ederholt was shot and killed by an unknown person, the police arrested dozens of strikers. 16 eventually stood trial, but no one was convicted. Then, in September, Ella Mae Wiggins, a popular speaker who wrote songs for the strikers, was shot and killed at a workers' rally. The union lost its fight, and North Carolina remains one of the lowest unionized workforces in the nation.
They labored in the textile factory from early morning till close.
Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
I can't be, Neil, and the reason I can't be is that we are a country that is being beaten on every front, economically, militarily. There is nothing that we do now to win. We don't win anymore. Our taxes are too high. I've come up with a tax plan that many, many people like very much. It's going to be a tremendous plan. I think it'll make our country and our economy very dynamic. But taxes too high, wages too high. We're not going to be able to compete against the world. I hate to say it, but we have to leave it the way it is. People have to go out, they have to work really hard, and they have to get into that upper stratum. But we cannot do this if we are going to compete with the rest of the world. We just can't do it.
So do not raise the minimum wage.
I would not raise the minimum.
remember, this is the guy who said we're going to bring back all these high-quality jobs. We're going to bring back manufacturing. It's going to be great. It's going to be tremendous. We're going to all be, the Donalds. And look, this is the thing that's always amazed me is the working class of this country has bought a lot of the Republican lines. And last night in Georgia, the debate between John Ossoff and Karen Handel really highlighted the stark differences between the ideological positions of folks in this country. You have conservatives who believe we need to give everything to the very wealthy, and then things will trickle down to the rest of us. That government should do nothing. That if you're poor, it's your fault. And healthcare, you go down the list of just ugly nastiness. And this woman, Handel, I mean, wow. One of the in watching the debate, one of the ugliest people, and this has nothing to do with looks. This is who she is inside. One of the ugliest people I think I've seen in politics in a very long time. It is fitting, however, that this is Newt Gingrich's seat. Is fitting. Now, Ossoff on the other side of this was, really thoughtful, articulate, really a great candidate for such a young guy. But I wanted to play one point on the minimum wage, and this really one of those things that just grabs you. Here the guy asks the question.
Does either candidate support a minimum wage increase? Mr. Ossoff, starts with you.
Yes, I do. The minimum wage should be a living wage. I think we can raise it indexed to the cost of living because the cost of living varies widely in urban and rural areas and in different states across this country. I think that increase needs to be implemented at a pace that allows business owners to adapt their business plans so they're not shocked. Their business plans are not shocked by a sudden increase in labor costs. But look, if someone's working a 40-hour work week, they deserve the kind of standard of living that Americans expect. That's part of the American dream, and there are too many folks who are having trouble making ends meet.
Minimum wage.
This is an example of the fundamental difference between a liberal and a conservative. I do not support a livable wage. What I support is making sure that we have an economy that is robust with low taxes and less regulation so that those small businesses that would be dramatically hurt if you impose higher minimum wages on them are able to do what they do best, grow jobs and create good paying jobs for people in the 6th District.
I listen to that and you got to wonder if she gets how utterly ridiculous she sounds. We're going to create an economy, a robust economy with no consumers, with people who don't have money to spend. And how do you come out and look, I'm sure this was a huge mistake on her part, saying I don't support a livable wage. I don't really know anybody who says that, you should work 40 hours a week and still be in poverty. I don't know anyone who says that you deserve that. Now, the reality is when you go back and you look at the golden age of our economy, prosperity was broadly shared. Working people got a larger share of that prosperity. In fact, I was just reading an article here just a couple hours ago that pointed out that right now the quote-unquote middle class of this country only controls about 20% of the nation's wealth, down from half just 50 years ago. And you go, well, where'd that money go? Well, we know where it went. It went upward. It didn't go down because poor people are still poor. That doesn't change. What has happened is that prosperous working class, that middle of the economy has gotten smaller and smaller. Fewer and fewer people are in the middle class, and we're turning into that, the robber barons and the rest of us, the very well-to-do in their gated communities and the rest of us. And you look at a lot of countries who we kind of look sideways at as banana republics, where you've got the wealth class living behind huge walls and gates, and then everyone else begging for scraps. That's where we're heading. And this idea that I don't support a livable wage is utterly ludicrous. And this is where I go back to my statement, when President Obama took over. My only hope for him at the time was that he returned the idea of reward and work. That if you work hard, you play by the rules, you get ahead. This minimum wage, I think, is part of that. The idea that you go to work and you're able to to live, that you don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to rent a small crummy apartment and to be able to put food on the table, that you actually have some ability to partake in the economy. And this isn't a liberal idea. It's a very conservative idea. In fact, Uncle Milty, who came up with the idea of the negative tax, which said we should be taxing rich people and giving it to poor people so that they spend it, very conservative idea. What has happened to the conservative movement in this country is they've gotten nasty. They're mean. They're greedy. It's about me and the heck with you. And you see that. This woman, probably one of the ugliest people I have ever seen in a debate. Nasty, mean, spiteful, with no ideas whatsoever. Everything that Ossoff brought up, she just threw back as, well, you liberal elitist, you should go to California. And it was just, you gotta watch that. Just utterly mind-blowing. I hope he wins. I do. Let's take a quick break. I'm right back. Stick around.
Minimum wage ain't gonna be my saving grace. It's just table scraps on an average man's plate. What no cover cage ain't gonna hold my soul all day. Well, I can hold my own, but I ain't gonna pull their weight.
I reaffirm clearly that the Paris Agreement remains irreversible and will be implemented.
Fallout is swift and global after Trump abandons Paris climate agreement.
Aren't you and the president talking about protecting the horse and buggy business just as cars come online?
Even Fox News questions the economic case for exiting the UN climate accord.
Pittsburgh is the poster child of showing why the Paris Agreement is good economics for the United States.
As states and cities step up to fulfill U.S. pledges. Plus, India announces it will sell only electric vehicles by 2030.
They're moving ahead. We're not. All of those stories and more straight ahead from BradBlog.com. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
I said during my confirmation process that climate change is occurring, that human activity contributes to it.
He's also said it was a hoax.
Well, Chris, the point here, and to your question,
the point is something that I'll figure out in a second. This is your Green News Report. Okay, Desi Doyen, I am so sorry that it has been so slow of late in the environmental news world. I hope you can come up with something to cover today.
Oh, I'm sure I'll manage.
Okay.
Say about the global swift fallout following United States President Donald Trump's announcement on Thursday that he will withdraw the United States from the United Nations Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the landmark global accord signed by 195 nations to cut man-made carbon emissions that cause dangerous global warming.
Yeah, that went over really well, didn't it?
Yeah, not so much. World leaders have all reaffirmed that they will move on with the global climate agenda without the U.S. French President Emmanuel Macron threw in a little light trolling when he reiterated that the Paris Agreement will be implemented globally.
We all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
Oh, snap.
Ironically, Trump's withdrawal finally got the broadcast news networks to actually cover climate change and the Paris Agreement. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt did a victory lap on all of the Sunday morning news shows, but he did get some pushback. Fox News' Chris Wallace questioned the wisdom of retreating from the global clean energy race.
The U.S. now employs more than double the number of people in the solar industry that it does in coal. Aren't you and the president talking about protecting the horse and buggy business just as cars come online?
Wow. If you got Fox News, Chris Wallace asking those questions, you know those guys are in trouble. And by the way, Scott Pruitt had no other answer other than, well, we need coal around near the power plants in case there's a national emergency. Well, you know what? Fine. Dig up some coal, put it in a pile, put it next to a power plant, and let the rest of us get on with a clean, livable planet.
Here at home, a new poll finds nearly 60% of Americans oppose Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord, and that includes a quarter of Republicans who say that they believe it will hurt America's standing in the world and will damage the U.S. economy. American states and cities are defying Trump's decision to halt U.S. action on climate change. On Friday, they announced the formation of the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's a growing group of cities, states, and corporations that will submit their own pledges to the United Nations in order to fulfill the United States' promised emissions targets that Trump has abandoned under the Paris Agreement. As of airtime, 12 governors, including 2 Republican governors, and more than 200 mayors have signed on. Trump singled out the city of Pittsburgh in his speech.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Well, that didn't go over well with the guy who actually represents Pittsburgh, Mayor Bob Peduto, a Democrat, who touted that Pittsburgh has actually reinvented itself as a green technology hub.
I was outraged. Pittsburgh is the poster child of showing why the Paris Agreement is good economics for the United States. And what we did today sets us back decades.
Peduto announced he signed new executive orders mandating the city's government will move to 100% renewable electricity sources and will convert its vehicle fleet to hybrid and electric cars.
It should also be noted that while Donald Trump thinks he represents Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh voted 80% for Hillary Clinton.
Speaking of electric cars, the government of India has announced new plans to sell only electric cars by 2030. That's to reduce the deadly fossil fuel air pollution that kills more than 1 million people in India alone every year. The move to electric cars is projected to save India more than $60 billion a year in imported oil costs, and the switch to electric vehicles could decrease India's carbon emissions by nearly 40% by 2030.
And yet, for all of those years, Republicans kept telling us that China and India would never do anything to reduce emissions. Going out now to buy Tesla stock. For all of those stories and the ones we couldn't get to, check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
And this has been your Green News Report.
Electric car on roads so dark, to change the end, rewrite the start. Electric car, so good so far. Electric.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
We need to stand united, for undivided we shall never fall. Remember all, we need to trust in and then forever call on our brothers and our sisters. And are you and I a win? You and I both know that we can rely on it.
So, interesting story out of the Kansas City Star. Turns out that in the state of Kansas, the Republicans and Democrats came together to override a veto of Governor Brownback's to raise taxes. Yes, you have heard that right. The overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate there in Kansas have voted to increase taxes of more than $1.2 billion over the next 2 years. The Senate vote was 27-13, and the House 88-31. Because look, what they've done in Kansas. You want to know what's the matter with Kansas? Brownback, conservative ideology, tax cuts for the wealthy, and, well, gutting education, health care, all of that stuff for everyone else. And finally, maybe they're at that point. The question is, how long does it take us here in Pennsylvania, where I live, to wake up to that reality? And here to talk about that, and also the big event they had on Monday, our good friend Mark Steer, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Mark, thanks for taking time for us.
My pleasure, Rick.
So, what do you get from this? Kansas, are they coming out of the conservative myth, out of the mist? What's going on?
You know, you took the words out of my mouth, because as I was preparing to get on the radio, I saw that report and I looked at some of the details. It's really quite striking. They had a $900 million deficit, and it's a much smaller state than Pennsylvania, and they just raised taxes an awful lot, rolling back many of the cuts to corporate taxes and to tax cuts on the wealthy that they had passed a number of years ago, and that had sent them into a terrible spiral of budget deficits and slow economic growth and more budget deficits. You know, they are the poster child for the idea that you can tax cut your way to prosperity, and they're the poster child that shows it doesn't work. The question is, when are we going to recognize that in Pennsylvania? Because we've been cutting taxes on businesses for years and years. We've been arguing that if we hadn't done those corporate tax cuts, we'd have a surplus this year and next year and money to invest in higher education and education. And that's the way to get to prosperity. So it's a matter of time before I think we come face to face with the right-wing ideology that's dominated our state and recognize that it's time for common sense to prevail.
Yeah, and you have to wonder how bad does it have to get? Because some of the stories I've heard come out of Kansas are just horrible, and you wonder what's it going to take for people here in Pennsylvania to wake up. Now, I understand on Monday you guys had a big rally, a big lobby day. Tell me what happened.
We had about 700 people in the rotunda. It was really rocking and rolling. It was a lot of fun for all of us because there's a lot of chanting, and it's great to give a speech before 700 people and have the kind of response I got and the other speakers got. And we're not leaving it there. I think we made a big statement that people in this state, people who care about education and human services and roads and bridges, are willing to see taxes go up if the rich and big corporations pay their fair share, and that's what we were saying. And we're not stopping there. We did a lot of lobbying. We have lobbying days in districts coming up on June 8th and 9th and 15th and 16th. And if people want to sign up to take part in those lobby days, they can go to our website, pachoice.org/budget-action, and sign up there. And we'll try to arrange lobby visits around the state with critical state legislators and get people in the offices and get them to hear this message again.
Now, looking at Kansas, do you think this will play with any of the Republican legislators in Pennsylvania? Because look, there's got to be an awakening moment. There's got to be an epiphany where you go, you know what? My schools are being harmed. The roads aren't being paved. We're kicking people off of vital services, and we're kicking the most vulnerable. Do you think that this might help, might play somehow?
I hope so. We're talking to legislators from time to time on both sides of the aisle, and it's a very strange experience to do that right now. People are walking around kind of wringing their hands saying, woe is me. They don't want to cut education. There's a small increase even in the Republican budget. They don't want to reduce that. They don't really want to cut human services. Although there's some Republicans who want to cut Medicaid, others know, well, hold on, this is not the time to be cutting Medicaid when there's so much uncertainty about federal health care issues. And yet they say they don't want to raise taxes, and they've got a budget deficit over 2 years that's approaching $4 billion.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Mark, and this is the reality, and I know nobody wants to cut these things. No, and everyone says, oh, we care and all that, but by default, you're making that choice. By not bringing in the revenue that we need, by deliberately being in the way of any enhancements, you're making that choice. You're deliberately making that choice not to get those programs to people because you refuse to bring in the revenue to pay for it.
Yeah, that's right. And now when we have the big deficits, they've got to face the fact that they've got to make a choice. They can't just cut their way to a budget, a balanced budget, without really harming lots of people who they say they do not want to harm. And I think they understand that the political consequences of deep cuts in human services and education are going to be painful for them. Look, we replaced the governor after 1 year because of major cuts, and I think, it will happen again, and people will turn on the legislature if they try to have drastic cuts to education and human services to balance the budget.
Now, you guys have got a pretty comprehensive plan that I think is actually a way forward. Because, look, most working people, they don't want their taxes raised. Nobody I know says, yeah, I want, jack up my tax rates. I'm doing so well because my wages have gone through the roof. We're talking about, closing some loopholes, talking about, taxing some of the shale that's being taken out of the state. Some sane, rational things, right?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to raise money without raising taxes on working people in the middle class. In fact, we have a plan that would actually lower taxes on working people in the middle class, change the personal income tax so that taxes on wages and interest go down a little bit, and taxes on income that mostly goes to wealthy people, capital gains, royalties, business profits, dividends, go up, it still would leave Pennsylvania with lower taxes on the very rich than any of our neighboring states, but would bring in $2 billion and cut taxes for 60% of Pennsylvanians. When we talk about pay your fair share, that's what we mean. When we talk about a severance tax, which every other state that has huge reserves of natural gas has, that's what we mean when, that's what paying your fair share means. Corporate tax reform, closing the Delaware loophole, that's what pay your fair share means. None of these taxes fall on working people in the middle class. In fact, we want to cut taxes on working people in the middle class. Our plan would cut taxes for someone making $50,000 a year by $135 a year.
So what do you say to the person that ultimately says, Mark, that sounds great, but ultimately the middle class is going to pay the brunt of everything because, we're where the money's at, supposedly?
Well, that's just not true. I mean, and in fact, that's our argument for fixing our upside-down tax system. Over the last 25 years, incomes for the top 1% have gone up 120%. Incomes for the bottom 99% has gone up 12%. One of the reasons we don't have enough money in this state is that we're not taxing the people who are making money. We're taxing the people whose incomes aren't going up. So we got to fix that. We got to fix the loopholes to allow corporations and natural gas drillers to get away without paying their fair share. And we would have plenty of money for the education and for the roads and bridges and the higher education and the pre-K and the human services that working people in the middle class actually need. And in fact, everyone needs. Yeah. Even if you're a really rich person, there's going to come a time where you need an investment in higher education because, you have a business, you want to hire qualified workers.
And the thing that gets me is, when you have these tax discussions, and I've had a couple of them lately, where people, the second you bring up the idea of raising taxes, their ears shut down, their mouth begins to foam, and like a dog, like a rabid dog, because we've been trained to anytime you talk about taxes, it's to immediately repel any discussion or any thought.
We just believe these myths that taxes are the barrier to economic growth. Well, you know what? It's time to look at the facts. Kansas is the perfect example. They cut taxes on the idea that they would have economic growth. Instead, they have had an economic disaster. Because what brings economic growth is not just private investment, but public investment. And taxes are a minor share of the cost of doing business. Businesses don't look to move one place or another on the basis of how high the taxes are. What they look for is, first, an educated workforce, and second, good roads and bridges and transit systems so that they can get their products out, they can get people in to work for them. Those are the two most important things.
Right, and then the third is how much they can get out of the state, how much they can shake the state down for handouts.
Right, but they're not going to shake a state down if the state doesn't have trained workers and good public transit.
Good point. So last question I've got for you. What do we do? I mean, the budget deadline's coming up, not too far down the road. What are we asking people to do?
Well, you know what? What we need is for the people who have good sense, who are listening and understand that we got to get beyond this no new taxes thing, to contact their legislators. Just pick up the phone, call your state legislator, go online. If you don't know who they are, tell them that you want a budget that puts people first, in which rich people and corporations pay their fair share. Tell them it's time to raise taxes on the rich and the corporations so that we can spend money on the public investments that we all need.
There you go. So we can have.
Just tell them. Keep telling them.
Yeah, show up at their town halls if they are courageous enough to have one. All of that stuff. Mark, great talk with you. Congratulations on the good event. I look forward to having you back soon.
Thanks very much, Rick.
Always great talking to you, Mark Steer. Again, you want to check out their website? We'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com. He's the executive director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. This is the Rick Smith Show.
We're in a fight to bring the middle class back, and we ain't even planning on losing in this mighty war. The working class is under attack. Get up, fight on. Stand up, fight on. Yes, we can fight on. To the death, fight on. Get up, fight on.
listening to The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1912. That was the day Boston Carmen of Local 589 voted to strike. Workers had been fighting to organize for years. They now demanded union recognition. In the months before the strike, union representatives had attempted to meet with management with no success. The president of the L, in the days before it was called the T, went so far as to summarily fire 282 employees, claiming the need to maintain discipline. Incensed at the union-busting maneuver, workers walked off the job in the early hours of the morning. They began cutting trolley ropes, smashing train windows, and removing handles on controller boxes. In an effort to bust the strike, management formed a company union. They also brought in over 700 professional strikebreakers and provided housing for the scabs. Over the course of several weeks, dozens of strikers were arrested on charges that ranged from calling strikebreakers scabs to trumped-up felony charges. AFL President Samuel Gompers visited the picket line in a show of solidarity. Area labor unions provided financial and legal support. The union filed charges with the State Board of Arbitration. They argued management had caused the strike by firing hundreds of workers for union activity and coercing workers against joining the union. Once the board confirmed the union's charges, the governor and mayor both pushed for resolution. As well, Boston's Central Labor Union threatened a general strike. Union recognition finally came on July 28th, and the first contract was signed a year later. Since that time, Local 589 has weathered more than a century of anti-union storms as it continues to fight for better wages, hours, and conditions. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
From United Nations headquarters in New York, this is your World in 2 Minutes. I'm your host, Luke Vargas, for Talk Media News. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley was in Geneva on Tuesday for a major announcement about whether the U.S. would remain in the UN Human Rights Council. Unlike the Paris Agreement on climate change, Haley said the U.S. wants to try and reform the Council from the inside, and she highlighted 2 ways the Council could regain its legitimacy and keep the U.S. as a member. The first was electoral reform.
Being a member of this council is a privilege, and no country who is a human rights violator should be allowed a seat at the table.
A second area of reform, she said, was toning down the council's focus on Israel, the only country with a permanent agenda item on its schedule.
It's hard to accept that this council has never considered a resolution on Venezuela, and yet it adopted 5 biased resolutions in March against a single country, Israel. It is essential that this council address its chronic anti-Israel bias if it is to have any credibility.
While Haley's speech to the council got a polite welcome, she faced a tougher crowd at a graduate school later in the day, where her praise of Israel was met with laughs.
This relentless, pathological campaign against a country that actually has a strong human rights record makes a mockery not of Israel, but of the council itself.
Later on, the crowd cheered when an audience member asked if the U.S. should be investigated for rights abuses at Guantanamo Bay, and she was heckled when she attempted to dodge the question. With the audience grumbling, Haley offered a surprisingly candid admission about how her role differs from the Trump administration as a whole.
While you may say the administration is not showing certain actions, I am. And I am part of that team.
For more global news headlines, visit TalkMediaNews.com.
Making the blue blood see red. The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. TheRickSmithShow.com. So, I look at this story out of Kansas. It's huge. I mean, honestly, truthfully, this is one of those moments where maybe, and look, don't get carried away, but maybe the Republican Party starts to find their way toward sanity. Maybe they wake up to the idea that cutting taxes on the wealthy, handing everything that you could possibly give over to corporations, you name it, from no taxes to land subsidies to you name it, free power for water. Look, I grew up in Cleveland back during the 70s and 80s. And what George Voinovich did as mayor of Cleveland back then was basically to give corporations whatever they wanted. And I saw it firsthand. The city brought in tons of Fortune 500 companies. In fact, at one point, I think Cleveland was one of the fourth or fifth highest number of Fortune 500 companies within their borders. That's what they were known for, because they'd given the baby in the bathwater away. They gave away free land. They gave away, since they had owned Muni Light, they gave away free power. Again, they owned Muni Light because Dennis Kucinich lost his job as mayor and let the city go into bankruptcy to hold on to it because they didn't want to privatize the one asset that would help. But that's a whole nother aside. Gave away free water, free power, free taxes, you name it, free everything. And with the idea that it's going to create jobs. And what happened is all these big industries, all these big businesses, brought their headquarters and their people with them. No new jobs and no new tax revenue because you gave it away. And somehow that was going to help. And you look at the Cleveland schools, they're in a shambles because you defunded them. And we've known this for a long time. And is it possible that Kansas has finally hit the wall? Because look, do I believe that the Republicans are horrible human beings? A lot of them, yeah. Most of them, sure. But some of them, no. Some of them don't want to cut health and human services. Some of them don't want to cut education. Some. Is this the moment where some of them go, we're on the wrong path? Because you get to a point, there's a default point. Inaction creates a default point. We don't have the money coming in to pay for the programs that we need. We don't have it. In fact, there's a giant, and the longer we wait, the bigger that hole gets, the more painful it becomes to service. Common sense. So by now saying no, 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 being the party of obstruction, which the Republicans have been. And I love to hear them crying about, we're $20 trillion in debt. And what have you done to try and fix that? Oh, nothing. You've actually made it worse. So again, you have these people who come in and say, we're going to block everything that happens. We're not going to give anyone the ability to solve these problems. And this is what the balanced budget people want. Because there are those who we should have a constitutional balanced budget amendment. You should never be able to spend more than you bring in, which on paper sounds rational until you realize that, well, if you don't bring in enough money, then there are vital programs that don't get funded. And if you end up in a crisis, you can't borrow to help get yourself out of it. Think about that for a minute. A lot of their rhetoric it sounds good. If we give rich people money, they run businesses, they'll expand the businesses because they've got more money to expand with. Sounds almost plausible. Here again, not realistic. You give rich people more money, you just make them richer. That's simple. It doesn't get any easier than that. And yet, here we are, still, after 30 years of this experiment, knowing what's going to happen, having seen the disastrous consequences and results, we are here in Pennsylvania where I live, still doing the same thing, and on the national level, wanting to do it even more. But I look at Kansas. Could Kansas be? Could it be? Could it be possible that Kansas is the beginning of turning this around, that even they now see it was a bad idea? I love the stories of the legislators who cast the vote against raising taxes first and then voted for the overturning of the veto, running and hiding in their offices because they didn't want to answer questions. These are people who saw the reality. And again, one of the things I give George H.W. Bush credit for, when he saw the books, even though the campaign pledge was read my lips, no new taxes, he did what was right. Just amazing stuff. Anyway, if you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com. That's where you get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go. You can also email me, Rick, at thericksmithshow.com. Thanks for being here. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
You've been listening to The Rick Smith Show. Together, we can make America better. Email Rick at thericksmithshow.com or interact with us anytime at thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
It's coming like the tidal flood beneath the lunar sway. Imperial, mysterious, in amorous array. Democracy is coming.